to the Open Fire podcast. Open Fire is an honest and informed dialogue on fire safety issues in the UK. We direct discussions with some of the fire industry's most prominent and recognised leaders. Your presenters are myself, Dave Calvert, Operations Director at Franken Risk Management Services, and with me I have Mr. CEO of CLM Group, Tom Gilbert. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Dave. How are you?
Excited.
What on earth are you wearing?
I've gone the extra effort this week, and it's interesting to see you haven't.
Yes.
I'm slightly disappointed we haven't managed to get a round table for this episode.
Oh yeah, I think so.
Stuck with our usual rectangular coffee table.
Is that a knighthood quip?
It is. I feel like this is as close as I'm going to get to being King Arthur.
Yes.
And this is the most amount of sirs I'm going to get around the table.
With my pocket square, can I be Guinevere then?
Absolutely, you can. We're on the sirs episode.
Yes.
Knights of the Round Table episode, as we're billing it. And very excited. And I thought I'd dress for the occasion. I'm disappointed
that I haven't.
Your tie hasn't made it, your cravat hasn't made it out of the cupboard.
So I think all I would say is, in all of the episodes that we've done over the last 5 years, Dave, I have always been the best dressed in the room. And you turned up in a tie, and the other people that came for our episode, who we'll introduce shortly, weren't wearing ties either, and you made them dress up, knowing I didn't have a tie.
Yep.
So I feel very sad.
It's going well so far.
It is, but I'm still wearing it better than you are, Dave. Anyway, we should probably move on.
So we've got two very prominent guests. We are very excited to have them in. I'm very grateful for them coming in. I'll introduce the first, and perhaps you want to introduce the second, Tom?
Absolutely.
So with us, we have Sir Bob Neill. Sir Bob is a barrister and King Counsel, my lord. He was MP for Bromley and Chislehurst from 2006 and stood down voluntarily, I think it's fair to say.
That's important to add in, Dave.
2024. He previously served as London Borough Councillor and leader of the Conservative group on the London Assembly. He's had a long connection with the fire service, having been the first leader of the London Fire and Civil Defence Authority, a member of the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority, and Minister for Local Government and Fire Services from May 2010 to September 2012. He was also a member of the all-party parliamentary group for leasehold reform, which examined the impacts of the cladding scandal on leasehold flat owners. Sir Bob was also appointed an honorary King's Counsel on 19th of January 2024. Sir Bob, welcome to the Open Fire sofa.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Dave. Delighted to be here, and good job I had the time in my pocket, isn't it?
I think that you all conspired against me, and I think we're going to be talking about ties for the remainder. It's also important that you were appointed Honorary King's Counsel on my birthday, so they obviously knew that that was the important date for everybody in the room.
Now everything is explained.
Absolutely.
Now it all falls into place.
So Sir Ken Knight also joins us on the sofa today. So Sir Ken commenced his fire service career in Surrey Fire Brigade and subsequently worked in a number of UK fire and rescue services during his 41-year career. He served as the Chief Fire Officer of Dorset and West Midlands Fire Services before being appointed as London's Fire Commissioner in 2003 until 2007. From 2007 until 2013, Sir Ken was appointed as the government's Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor for England, advising ministers and senior officials on fire policy matters and providing advice during major and catastrophic emergencies. Following the Grenfell Tower tragedy in 2017, the UK government appointed Sir Ken as the chair of the Independent Expert Advisory Panel. Sir Ken has been providing advice and support to the public and private sector organisations and is the independent member of the Palace of Westminster Fire Safety Committee. Her Majesty the Queen awarded Sir Ken the Queen's Fire Service Medal in 1991 and the CBE in 2001. Sir Ken was knighted in the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2006 in recognition of his outstanding contribution to the Fire and Rescue Service. He was appointed as a Deputy Lieutenant for Richmond-on-Thames, London from 2007 to 2016. Sir Ken, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm grateful for the invitation. I particularly look forward to talking to Sir Bob, who was my minister in the time you referred to, and so it's great to see Bob here as well. So I look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us. So I think I'll go off piece for the first question, because then we can turn the page and make a big noise when we turn pages. But the first question to you, Sir Ken, really, Grenfell Tower tragedy in 2017. How did life change for you the day after that happened? What's life been like since?
Well, it was a real turning moment for everyone involved in fire in particular, but the construction industry as well, of course, as I'm sure we're going to talk about. Partly because since my start in the fire service, fire deaths in the home in particular have been coming down and down and down. So I well recall in those early days as a firefighter, where I joined as a firefighter, there was something like 700 deaths a year, decreasing to something like 199, 200, and therefore one looks at the cause of that, and it was to do with fitting of smoke alarms in the home, which were almost non-existent in the 1960s, foam-filled furniture regulations, smoking material bans in certain areas. And yet suddenly we had this horrific fire with 72 deaths in a single fire. So I think there was an element of shock and complacency that are built in, that fire and our understanding of fire in buildings and in the UK was under control, and we were on the right trajectory. And I think it was a matter of real shock. I have to say, I, of course, like many of us in this room, saw it on the television on those days, and my horror as the horror unfolded. And I was of the belief there were probably firefighters also imminent risk in that fire inside the building.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the same question to you, Sir Bob. How did life change for you after the fire? Obviously, you've been appointed onto panels to talk about some of the for want of a better word, the fallout of the sorts of things that led into that disaster. How have things changed for you?
Well, like Ken, I was out of government by then, so I think I watched it on television almost certainly as well. And I was actually just horrified at the sight of it. And then, obviously, subsequently, there have been things where impacts on my constituents and other people have obviously been very important to me and going forward. But I think I did very much agree with Ken going back, because I first got involved with the fire service back in about 1985 when the GLC was being abolished, and they created this new standalone authority, the London Fire and Civil Defence Authority, and I became the first leader of that, and did that for 2 or 3 years. And that's when we were beginning to see that decline in fire deaths from about the mid-80s or so, as Ken says. We saw a very consistent downward trajectory, and that was for all the reasons Ken sets out. Yet we thought that technological change in a raft of areas, some which included, we had hoped, better building and so on, but also lots of other things, had changed the focus of where fire was. We were doing a lot more work about fire prevention. And then when I came back as a member of the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority in 2000, that trajectory at that stage was continuing. Yeah. And that was, again, what we were looking at. Much more smoke alarms, much more education, more talk about RTAs.
Yes.
More talk about the service actually as first responders in many respects, rather than the straightforward type of old-fashioned, dare one say it.
Yes.
Really terribly risky firefighting. So I think it was a great shock to all of us that suddenly you saw that reversed.
Yes.
And then, of course, thereafter, I think the initial concern was, how does one respond to this? And clearly there's lessons to be learnt massively from that. But I'd also had friends who were involved in local government in London. My own chief executive in Bromley had to be part of the gold team that was sent in because there wasn't, as the report says, sufficient capacity in the individual royal borough to cope with it. It's a digression, but it brings back the human element. One of the things that I'm really keen on when I'm not involved in politics is opera, funnily enough. And for years, my wife, who's a singer, and I have been supporters of Opera Holland Park, which isn't that far away, based in Holland Park, in the Royal Borough. And actually, Holland Park Opera since then have done a great deal to support Grenfell survivors and Grenfell families. But one of the girls who worked front of house at Holland Park, who I'd met, lost her life in Grenfell. So actually, even for those of us who might be remote, it brought it home very personally. This is the person shown us to our seats over the years, picked up programmes from, and so on. So that, I think, personalised it for us as a family to a degree, and everybody else that was involved with that actually really great opera company. But then also, you then get the emails from very worried constituents
Of course.
pretty quickly saying, look, we live in a tower block. It's been converted at a certain time, around the time these things were happening. We're really worried about, are we safe living in our homes?
Yeah.
And that was then obviously another very important thing that changed things for, I think, for all of us involved in representing constituents in one way or another, councillors or members of parliament.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you asked about the immediacy. I probably didn't answer that. Was the immediate effect? The immediate effect was interesting in that in the immediate hours, not days, the weekend immediately after the tragedy, the government officials called in experts with some really hard-nosed questions being asked at that time, of course, by public, but particularly ministers. The experts included current fire safety experts, academics, construction experts, building and control experts, and I was amongst that group that was invited to be brought in to discuss in really some really difficult and wicked questions. Could this happen again? And if this building was built like this, are there any more like it? And I think it's fair to say in those very early hours of discussion, the discussion was, well, it clearly, as we all understood, didn't meet building regulations.
Yes.
And if there are any more, we don't know. We hope there's very few. Of course, we now know it wasn't few.
No.
And we were tasked with putting it on. I was asked to chair the group, put together the way of examining buildings easily to find out if the ACM cladding, the external cladding of the type used at Grenfell, was elsewhere in the country with a simple laboratory test, which was developed by academics and scientists. But it was a really fast piece of work in order to satisfy the needs, both politically and the public. Were there any more risks like Grenfell in the country?
Absolutely.
And that was a shock.
And I think Dame Judith, who sat exactly where you two were sat a few episodes ago, she said that the very basic questions around, so how many high-rise buildings have we got, full stop, was information that we didn't have. There wasn't that information around the numbers of buildings, let alone whether the cladding that was at Grenfell Tower existed anywhere else. We just didn't have the information. It was information we'd never kept and never recorded.
Yeah, that's right. There'd been a discussion, I seem to recall, when I was a minister, about whether or not there should, done through the sector, through the housing sector, be a register drawn up. TSA was going to do it.
Yes.
And we were encouraging them to do so as a department. We didn't hold that information centrally. I forget, government departments often don't, because we're not the direct deliverers of that.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, they decided, for whatever reason, not to proceed with that. And so there was, I think, for my ministerial successors and Ken's successors, a real challenge about finding out just what is the number that's involved, never mind anything else.
I think it's really interesting to sort of. So, Bob, you briefly referenced back in 1985 when you became more involved in that side of things, and to have the 2020 perspective of hindsight that it gives us all, to be able to go back decades and to sort of see with a different perspective where mistakes may have been made by consecutive governments, different governments, not making a party political point by any means. But looking back, going back to the 80s, even, I mean, there's discussions about deregulation from Cameron's government. But if we go back further than that, then we went from the fire certificate culture to the risk assessment culture, and we go back further than that. There was a really good quote, interesting quote about cutbacks, which I actually got from 1980, and it was from the Home Office Review and Fire Policy and the Future Fire Policy. And it's a beautiful bit of double-speak worthy of Humphrey from Yes Minister. It said, there may be over-provision which may enable judicious reductions to be made, which would not result in an unacceptable increase in property loss or casualties, essentially giving the green light for cutbacks in the fire service is what it was getting to, but it's a very typical civil service way of going around it. I'm just wondering if you go back across that sort of time period, and it's a question to both of you, is there any missteps that were made that in terms of deregulation, in terms of cutbacks, in terms of changes from the certificate culture that really were big signposts of a change in direction in the wrong direction now that you look at it?
I don't see it in quite the terms of any single significant misstep, because I think there was a general movement for saying, look, all public services have to be looked at again in the way, in the light of changing technology, for example. That really was a big issue, I think, in the minds of a lot of people, those of us involved in the fire service, and at the same time, virtually throughout the whole of my time in public life, local government services, and fire service is a local government service, were under financial pressure. So that there were always squeezes. I think when I became leader of the fire authority back in '85, I was asked to go and see Margaret Thatcher's fire minister at the time, and he said, "Look, what we really need, Bob, from you is you've got to take £5 million out of the budget and do it without a strike." We managed to do it, actually, but that may not sound a lot now. That was a lot then. So even then, there were pressures. Now, at those days, I think I seem to it was much more around things like working practices. Did you actually need the same levels of manning at all times of day, and so forth? Stuff that was much more workforce orientated in terms of, when I was talking to people about taking some slack out, was a slack that could be identified around that. The extent, for example, to which the job had become much more based on much better kit for firefighters, rather than some of the heavy lifting, if you like, literally physically, that we used to have to do. So that was the area I think a lot of politicians' attention was. Where I do think, perhaps, looking at it in retrospect, there may not have been the same political attention, public attention paid to some of the regulatory sides of things, just inevitably, because it's the workforce issues dealing with the FBU and so on, which attract publicity, attract attention in the political world. So, looking at what we now know, it's pretty clear that although I think it was not unreasonable to look at reducing burdens of regulation and updating regulation, there may have been some fracturing of who had responsibility. I think that's an issue there. And it also strikes me now, having reviewed some of the papers I had when I was a minister, I virtually never got a submission in relation to building control, because that wasn't my responsibility. That was a different minister, albeit we were in the same department. I got submissions on fire safety, but not on building safety. And I get the sense from looking at the Grenfell report that over many years, the two have been in separate silos to some degree. And maybe there wasn't enough join up there. And what I think we now know much more of, which was very low key at the time, were things like the risk of commercial conflicts of interest in the way things like the building research establishment, the fire research establishment, and others had gone along. If there was a big error, I think maybe it was the move towards things like self-certification for the whole raft of building control and what went with that approach, which was established under governments of both parties, interestingly. So it wasn't a left-right sort of thing at all.
Yeah, and my period of being a chief advisor in particular, the being a chief officer, has always been apolitical. So I was the chief fire and rescue advisor to both the Labour administration and the incoming coalition government. And I didn't sense a change particularly in that. And I don't think it was about regulation for me. It was about the general appreciation that the sector itself needs to take a lead on key issues. And I think that's still the case, by the way, because I don't think you can spoon feed professionals. You need to have them stand up and be candid and understand. What I think the misstep was misunderstanding in many cases, which has been shown, the lack of competence in the sector and lack of assurance that the sector had the ability to deliver some of the things that we thought they could deliver. Even now, of course, I'm sure Dame Judith said the same in hers, there is no intention to take away that competence from the sector and tell them what to do. So just increasing regulation when people have failed to meet regulation doesn't mean to say you've cracked the problem, because the people that actually flaunted the regulation before will continue to flaunt a different regulation, although sticks and carrots have a part to play. The underlying theme, in particular of Judith's report, is about competence and culture in the industry. And so I think it's a systemic problem, but I think all is misunderstood. You talk about a misstep. that in some ways the competence and the culture wasn't there in some parts of the sector to deliver what we thought was an assured, safer environment.
Yeah.
Do you think there's some culpability in that, talking about that competence issue in terms of the RRO when it came out in 2005, where it was very much competency was mentioned, but it wasn't prescribed what was considered competent.
Well,
and there was an industry of risk assessors who were qualified or unqualified. They were out there doing it, and to some extent they still are today.
Certification, and I meant to say that you said should return. So the predecessor to the regulatory fire safety order was, of course, a certificated route where you left someone with a certificate, and the fire and rescue service would do that. I was part of that regime because I was an inspecting officer way back in the 70s, and was part of those acts that did just that. But actually, that didn't give you any more assurance. It was rather like an MOT, because the moment you'd left the building didn't mean to say your lights would work or the brakes would work.
Well, the answer is that there were still fires in the certificate culture, King's Cross.
Absolutely, it didn't stop it, did it?
You needed the ownership within the management of the building. We call it a responsible person, don't we, in legislation, to take ownership for their building and their risks, and not, I've got a certificate, therefore I'm okay, because you may not be on the day after having got that certificate. And the fire risk assessor issue is a very interesting question. It was an area that I raised, and indeed was criticised for in the report by Chief Advisor, but it was in that context, and it is with hindsight, it was in the context of believing that the sector would want to step up and be competent in providing fire risk assessments. And bearing in mind the fire safety order itself is so broad, from everything from Mrs. Biggins' bed and breakfast of one bedroom through to the most complex buildings, both industrial and life safety. There is a graduation of competence of fire risk assessments, a short you undoubtedly need.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. And I think the whole thrust of what I was being tasked to do and Eric Pickle was being tasked to do wasn't actually that much different from what, say, John Denham, Eric's predecessor, had been seeking to do immediately before that, which was actually to say to the sector, actually, you ought to step up to the mark. You've got a very substantial fire safety industry. You've got a very, very large construction industry. It's not unreasonable at a time when you have to prioritise and to ration what the public can make available. You have to make sure that the public spend goes into stuff which only the public can do.
Yes.
And that, for example, is therefore the front line firefighters, the front line kit, and so on. That nobody else can really sensibly provide that in our system. It's not unreasonable to expect a sector which was making very good profit in many areas out of this to be professional in the same way as I would expect a fellow barrister to be professional.
Yes.
Maybe that's just a natural culture, and we assume that will be the same, many of us. But there are, of course, regulatory standards for barristers, for lawyers, for many other professionals. We didn't think it was unreasonable for the sector to develop its own, as other professions have actually, and other sectors have done that successfully. And Ken's right. I think maybe we were over-optimistic about the capacity of them to do that at the speed that was needed. And also, perhaps, there wasn't, I'm not playing any individuals at all in this, but maybe there was collectively not a willingness to be as frank as would have been helpful as to what the limits of the capacity actually was. People didn't want to say no, if you like.
Do you think possibly then, going back to that sort of hindsight question, as the interpretation of the reduction in fires over a significant period of time, slowly over years, that, and I posit this as a hypothesis rather than fact, but could that have been misinterpreted by politicians of the various governments and used as a reasoning for lighter touch regulation, reductions in fire service manning, that kind of thing? Would that have been the kind of thing that they would have looked at to justify those sort of, as I say, lighter touch approach?
That would be one of a number of measures. It was one when I was minister, and when I was the shadow minister, you'd obviously regard as very important, because, and it's moving on to something that happened earlier, before Grenfell, but later in the story, which is the argument about whether or not fire safety regulation should be in the red tape challenge, where actually Eric and I were able to argue with Ken's professional assistant successfully that they shouldn't be in the red tape challenge. So I think we were always conscious in some areas the life-saving issue was absolutely fundamental.
Yes.
I think it may be more that the areas of concern that were raised were different. When I I had a file of papers to look at when the Grenfell inquiry was looking for potential witnesses. In the end, I wasn't called to give evidence to the inquiry, but I asked my former officials to get out all the papers I had. That's where I noticed, how little the fire services minister and his officials were necessarily involved in the building regs side of things, but also all the things that I was getting, and that Ken was getting as our advisor, when it did talk about a controversial issue around safety, particularly in tall buildings, it was around sprinklers. The discussion and a huge amount of the political debate was around a very strong campaign to have all new build housing fitted with sprinklers. And a lot of people made a case very forcefully, and there are arguments either way about that. And Ken and I were never convinced on the evidence, and I still don't think the evidence maintained that. Unless I think we agreed about 30 metres or something like that at the end of the day. But maybe that was where the focus was.
Yes.
For a lot of people, because that was what was getting the publicity. And government does have its priorities inevitably shaped by publicity. Members of Parliament, who then are holding ministers' account, have their priorities shaped by what their constituents are raising.
Yes.
That. And it was sprinklers that was very much the thing that was capturing the attention. And the materials, certainly within my part of the fire world, were not really being discussed very much at all. There was evidence from the various reports that we had that wasn't flagging up that. Now, we now know that some reports were not being passed up the chain, even within DCLG. I mean, part 2 of the report makes that quite clear.
Yeah.
Now, there's clearly a failing, but I think that's why it wasn't people deliberately changing their eyes or maybe ignoring information. I think just the focus, for a raft of reasons, wasn't particularly on materials at that time, or certainly on those types of materials.
Yeah, I think you slightly misrepresent the effect of reductions on fires on the Fire and Rescue Service. In fact, I did a review called Facing the Future, and under Bob's regime, as it were, and it was recognising that fires and fire deaths had reduced consistently and fairly rapidly, and yet we had still focused the Fire and Rescue Service broadly on firefighting. And there was a need to recognise you needed to have a different competence, but probably the same personnel, to do fire safety more actively on the ground, particularly the most vulnerable. And that shift, what I called in my report latent capacity, was not to shift those people that you didn't need in the Fire and Rescue Service at all, but there was a part to play when they weren't active on fire stations. Those same people could play. They were a very trusted deliverer of a message, young or old, unlike, I have to say, many other services.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
You can much easier get a firefighter into the home of an old people to talk about risk and safety, and broader than fire than you can, for example, a police officer.
Yes.
Very much.
So they played a very active role across the piece. And so I think that shift wasn't just about reduction of fire services, it was about a shift of emphasis that wouldn't prevention be better than cure, while still having a very effective firefighting workforce to respond if you needed to.
Yeah, occasionally you always needed that ultimate latent resilience there, but the shift, and I think it was a legitimate one, because not just in the things that Ken's talked about, we found that when firefighters were doing that, I think the service stepped up to the mark in terms of that. Fire prevention work, there's a lot of actually embraced quite enthusiastically. But you found they could work with local authority social services. Identifying vulnerable people might be an issue about their smoke alarm, but they could pick up other things because the firefighter was a trusted person, wasn't seen as an authority figure who might be a threat, much more as a helper in a different way to other uniform type services.
Well, I remember I'm now going to reminisce, but I remember when I was I worked in fire safety for Broomley Housing Association, who obviously took over the London Borough Bromley stock. And I remember having regular meetings with the borough commander at the fire station at Bromley North, and we would talk about home fire safety visits and how we got the fire brigade access to our most vulnerable clients. And it was fundamentally about the recognition of actually, well, when the fire happens, where do people die? And actually, when fires happen, people most likely to die if there is a fire are the most vulnerable, right? So generally speaking, if a fire happens in my house, I'm probably all right, actually. But when you go and start talking to, the very, very elderly, for example, who are living in bungalows, who would never have had their house on a high-profile list from a fire safety perspective. But the reality is the fatalities happen when the fires start in bungalows, generally because of the occupancy. And obviously a lot of what you were doing, Sir Ken, with that, was the theory of that, which in practice did work, was about getting firefighters in front of people and saying, Do you need a new do you need a new electric blanket? That looks a bit knackered, that one. Do you need a deep fat fryer? And if you do, maybe we'll get rid of that pan of oil that you've got on the stove because that's going to catch fire. And can you get out? And, have you got a smoke detector? Those sorts of things. And the big decrease around fatalities wasn't about the number of fires reducing, really. It was about when they happened, people knew about them because in the 80s, obviously up to the 90s, the increased prevalence of smoke detection, which was a massive thing. The furnishings regulations around the content of the materials in sofas, and I think you were part of the safer smoking regulation as well. And obviously, when you consider the number of fatalities, that's huge. That would have prevented a huge number of fatalities. Just that one piece of legislation about the way cigarettes should go out.
Safer cigarettes.
Absolutely, that's critical. And then add to that the community fire safety aspect of it. Fundamentally, you're in a situation of trying to reduce them. Detect them and get people out and identify the most vulnerable, and actually that worked really well. And I think there seems to be a problem where people don't seem to be able to separate the general trajectory of fatalities and injuries in fires and what happened at Lakanal House. Actually, I'll add that one, but obviously what happened at Grenfell Tower. Those things they're not linked. The reality of those things, those two things aren't linked. The reality of Lakanal House and Grenfell Tower was more building driven, actually, rather than a fire safety problem around detection and suppression. And obviously you talked about the sprinklers and the fact we were at 30 metres, and I think Scotland were at 18 at the time. Right. Wales was anything over a bungalow would have to have them, and in Northern Ireland there was no rules at all around sprinklers. But actually the reality of the Grenfell Tower fire is more about buildings and design and implementation. That there are certain factors around, and dependent on who you ask, they will always say, well, the fire brigade was under-resourced and didn't have enough kit. Everyone's going to say that no matter what fire you get. And I think you've just done a report that does actually acknowledge the fact that the fire brigades probably could do with modernisation and, some investment in it. And I think we would say that about all of our emergency services all the time. But I think there is a big disconnect between what happened at Grenfell Tower and what the trajectory of fire fatalities was telling us from the 80s to probably the day it happened, actually. And then obviously we realised there is this problem in the industry, and Professor Jose Torero summed it up beautifully, was this ability to unzip all the fire precautions in one go, that the cladding issue. And I remember being interviewed and told, can cladding ever be safe? And I said, well, of course it can. It just depends which flavour cladding you have, right? So I think that for me, the reality is we've gone through this from the 80s to the 20s, 1980s to 2020. We've gone through this big increased prevalence in technology to support safety. And now we're at the point where we've started to realise that technology in buildings is such that we now need to untechnology the buildings, because obviously the sorts of materials that were being used were almost regulation couldn't keep up with them. The sorts of materials the building products we were starting to use. And I think that becomes something that we need to really consider. I know it's going to be difficult to talk about it because obviously we've got Grenfell Tower Phase 2 has just been released, but in respect of that, how Sir Ken do we sort of address the concerns and criticisms relating to the fire services response?
Yeah. I'd just like to reflect on what you just said, because you're absolutely spot on. It used to be said some years ago that fire doesn't discriminate, and of course you're absolutely right. It does discriminate.
It does.
It's the elderly, it's the infirm, those that are at most risk are also most at risk from fire. So we shouldn't forget that in this clamour to deal with, quite rightly to deal with, construction difficulties and compartmentation and all those issues there is still a high risk area of people, the demography of where people live and how they live. And for that reason, I'm very conscious that, of course, we were right, and the whole of the focus of the Building Safety Act, Bob, is about high-rise residential buildings.
Yeah.
But we must be careful not to fixate those as high risk, because quite rightly the legislation changed to becoming higher risk, not high risk, because there are many other types of demographics. They may be in Rose Park in Scotland with the old people's home or nursing homes that offer risks in terms of likelihood or effect that aren't necessarily high rise. So we do have to be careful to maintain that.
That's right. That's interesting, isn't it? Because Grenfell Tower picks up on a report that you did after Lacanau. Where you made the point that actually, although it clearly is a factor, it can be arbitrary, and that's, I think, the phrase that Grenfell Phase 2 report uses, that purely using height as a sole metric.
Yes, it does.
It's an arbitrary thing, and it
Yes,
does. It follows on that bit we were recognising. We're moving towards that when we asked for some of the guidance to social housing associations and providers to be revised around that.
Yeah, and the DCLG guidance said, and obviously it was heavily redacted after Grenfell Tower. It said in there, high rise does not mean high risk.
Yes, exactly.
That was written in guidance.
It's a conversation we've had in previous episodes, actually, Tom. Going back to a BBC interview you did yourself shortly after Grenfell, and at the time you were a lone voice saying we shouldn't be looking at the building height, we should be looking at the people in buildings, the type of people in buildings, which is exactly the point.
And that was when Croydon were committing to put sprinklers in all their high-rise buildings when they didn't have them in all of their care homes.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but it seemed to many of us a much more obvious place to put sprinklers.
Absolutely. Where in fact, where's your best buck spent? Well, actually, when you have a fire, people are going to die in those places.
Exactly.
In those places, people are most likely to get out. So actually, let's focus off limited funds over there.
But it's also important that and I, by the way, I completely support that view, Tom. But it's also important you don't neglect those other areas of fire safety that may be about complementation, maybe about fire doors, maybe about making sure there's closures on fire doors, that actually sprinklers won't be the panacea if you ignore all the other issues about fire spread and hearing what the residents have to say and ensuring they're probably aware of a fire.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I'm going to go on assumption that you haven't read the entire Stage 2 Grenfell report as yet, but you're probably aware of the recommendations. I just wondered, as a sort of an overview, is there any key areas you feel were either omitted that perhaps should have been recommended, or any recommendations that Sir Martin Morbick made that perhaps were flawed or not necessary?
I think there's a number of them that I looked at, some of which I've looked at a little bit more than others because they relate more to the area that I had experience of. And I can see sense now in making sure that there is a means of achieving greater consistency of standards, for example, around risk assessment and so on. I think that's a perfectly fair and sensible thing. I think there's a lot of very good practical things that Ken will know more about than I. One struck me which sounds great in theory, but just a caveat of practice, and that's the idea that there should be a single Secretary of State responsible for all of this. That sounds obvious up to a point, because that's actually only looking, with respect to Sir Martin and his team, at the just top of the pyramid. If there's an issue that I would have identified from that, it is a matter I've referred to earlier, the siloing, which is endemic in UK government and many other governments anyway, that there was a team of small teams of officials, very small numbers of people dealing with policy around building safety and fire safety. They were in separate departments, and maybe there wasn't, as I think he suggests, necessarily the level of supervision by more senior officials to make sure that joined up. Now, if ministers, be it a Secretary of State or a junior minister, ultimately act on the information that comes to them from their officials.
Yes.
So saying one Secretary of State does it all doesn't solve your problem unless you have got a means within government to make sure that information is being shared. So I think, I'm not saying the principle is wrong, but you could beef that up or realise that otherwise could be purely tokenistic and it might raise hopes that wouldn't be achieved.
Yes.
But, a lot of other, I think, very sensible things in there, which I wouldn't necessarily argue with at all.
Yeah, it's a very complex report, of course. You expect it to be after that amount of time. And yes, I have read it, and I think, and I'm actually pleased that the government haven't come out with an immediate knee-jerk reaction of saying we accept all the recommendations.
It makes a change.
It's actually taken a much more considered view, in my view, to say within 6 months is what the current Prime Minister has said. We will review. I also understand from my speaking to officials, they're not intending to come out with a single tome of a report. So having read one, we're now going to read the government review. As issues need to be taken, they will come to a view of what the government's position. One of those undoubtedly will be disability and living and PEEPs and those issues about high rise, and that is one of the urgent issues to be addressed. I'm less certain about the need for another regulator. I mean, having Judith recognised the regulators, Sir Martin is suggesting there is a further regulator on structural safety regulator of some kind, and I'm not sure that's completely clear. And he does seem to ignore, whether it's deliberately ignoring, the fact there is already an institution of fire engineers, and yet recommends that such a body ought to be set up. I mean, that's the fast read, isn't it? Even in the in-depth read, you have a job to understand where that is. But most of the issues, without a doubt, he has, as public inquiries do, he's got under the skin of systemic failure. He's got under the skin of lack of changes, the competency issues, the very complex issue about competencies, even in fire risk assessors, which I think is quite thoughtful, because we know that competence isn't just about academic learning in the individual. It's about experience, but you can have bad experience. And so to then, and I think what it proves is, including in fire risk assessors, you need people to understand their limitations of doing that sort of work. Otherwise, it doesn't matter all the learning they will have, they will not be able to operate competently in that field. So I think that's a really interesting. Just one more thing, I think the other area that I think is going to be very challenging, and it is challenging, is the complete lack of capacity, and indeed academic lack of capacity, for fire engineers. Because I think that's going to be a really big blockage to take some of the real issues forward.
I agree with Ken. I think those are key things that are well identified, the whole question of the assessors and professionalising, improving competence there, and the engineers' situation. I think is matter. And we'll have seen, and a lot of your listeners will have known, the problems there were with the EWS1 forms, for example. Of actually a lack of capacity of people to be able to carry out the work. So that obviously perhaps it wasn't the panel's job, but I think one needs to be aware that to wish something, you've actually got to deliver the means to get that delivered on the ground. And at the moment, I'm not sure we can do that. The same would apply to talk about changes to local authority building control. Anyway, there is a concern, I think.
Well, capacity is a huge problem in all of these scenarios. Capacity will always be a problem, and particularly capacity and competence. Because I think, and we've talked about it before, Dave, is that the reality is that in theory, there isn't more buildings being built now than there ever were. So why is there such a strain on competent fire people? And the reality is because they just simply weren't used. And they would be approached piecemeal, and it would be very rare as a fire engineer that you'd be engaged at REBA Stage 3 and you'd stay there all the way through REBA Stage 5 to see the building that you've been part of the design of. You'd finish at REBA Stage 5 as it started, and you'd disappear off, and there'd be no fire engineers on site at all looking at, the novel building conditions that they didn't plan for, but now they're looking at. And I think that competency thing is really problematic, and the limitations of the understanding of your own competence is something that's really being pushed now. That kind of the unconscious incompetence, and starting to become, to acknowledge that you're not capable. And I think the tiered registers that we're starting to see around, if you're doing a really super duper building, you've got to be very high up versus
I think that's
very low down.
Just to just build on that, exactly the point I was going to make, Tom. Ken mentioned the IFE. There is, of course, the IFSM, the tiered fire risk assessors register, TFRAR. So the industry, to some extent, has introduced these things, and that's where you would find. I think that's probably the most prominent register out there for fire risk assessors. I think it's well recommended amongst the industry. And that if our listeners are selecting a fire risk assessor, that's a good place to start. In terms of selecting a fire risk assessment company, you have things like BAFE SP 205 to demonstrate that company is capable of doing fire risk assessments.
FRACs.
So the or FRACs, yep, not the only one. So the industry is introducing these things, and it has for some years now. I think it's just fair to point that out as on the other side of the coin.
But Bob talked about some of those cross-governmental issues. So fire engineering itself, you could argue, could really be helpful to have a cross-government look at. One university in the last year, as you probably know, stopped doing its fire engineering course.
Yeah, it's Glasgow Cali, wasn't it?
Yeah. And so you think, well, where is education in this? Who is coming to 18 and says, what I really want to be is a fire engineer in the future, and where are the courses that those potential fire engineers can go for? They'll need experience as well, but where they can get their qualification. So I think there is cross-cutting issues way beyond fire, Bob, in places like education,
certainly.
of how you can encourage people into these professions in order to make buildings safe, as much as architects are being developed through universities, to be part of the whole of the system, because we won't achieve that capacity without everyone recognising how to achieve those qualifications to be able to be competent.
I think that's why we're going to start the Open Fire Academy, Tom. Is that
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah. Why not? I think the so I think just to build on the capacity issue. Today, I think it was yesterday actually, but obviously in the contents when we release it, it won't be yesterday because we don't release this tomorrow, right? But Angela Rayner committed to speeding up the cladding remediation plan, and said, and said we're not going fast enough. We must spend more money on it as a government. We must make this stuff happen. And I think the real life account from Dave and I's perspective, and from the industry's perspective, and those that are out there remediating, organisations like mine are doing the contracting of the remediation, and Dave's doing the design and the identification through FRAWs and other aspects. Does the new building safety regime create an unnecessary level of bureaucracy? Because to accelerate things would require the regulator to be able to deal with more applications at a faster rate, and our experience is that they're really struggling actually with capacity. They are currently the bottleneck. What is it, Ken, that they need to do? What's the situation with the regulator?
The building safety regulator, of course, is born out of the HSE, and so they've got a real task ahead, and they are the nominated building safety regulator. I think there's a real current issue. We overuse the word capacity, but a capacity issue here too. So at the moment, the change, particularly the changes in higher-rise residential building, of course, require building control approval, and that approval is required from the building safety regulator. And I'm sure if you speak to both local councils and you speak to housing authorities, you will hear some woeful stories where they are trying to get their fire safety works done, and yet there's a huge backlog in the building safety regulator. Yes. Only last week I was talking to someone that said they want to get they need fire doors, they've been specified on the fire doors, but it's going to take them 8 months to get approval from the building safety regulator. That leaves a vacuum of people having fire doors they shouldn't be having. And the building safety regulator also, and I'm not critical of this, I'm quizzical, has a view that when you submit your information as a building owner or a council, they only reject it. They can't give you advice.
No.
Because that's a conflict of interest for them as a regulator. Now, I'm puzzled by that because the Fire and Rescue Service does just that. On the Fire and Rescue Services Act, it has a statutory duty to give advice, and it's also the enforcement under the regulatory fire safety order. So I'm really trying to interested in getting under the skin of that, or why the HSC believe they can't give advice. They purely say reject, but we're not telling you why. And this backlog, which I know they're now saying that will be there until the financial year 25, worries me if there's outstanding building works, and back to the Deputy Leader's comments, how we're going to get those done if there's a backlog in fire safety works that can't be approved by the regulator purely because of capacity, which they say they're having to address by recruitment. But there'll be the same people, won't there? There'll be fire engineers and people that they're looking for as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And we've talked about this, is the reality of a commercially in a market where competence is tight and resources is tight. What does that do to prices and salaries? Well, actually they go up, right? And then we'd say, well, Mr. or Mrs. Fire Engineer, would you like to go and work for one of the large fire engineering organisations on a mental salary? Would you like to go and work for the HSE as a regulator on this sort of salary? And I know that people will want to do that, and it's not all about money, but in order to recruit the best, where would they? I don't understand how they will fulfil that level of.
Well, one of the
capacity.
biggest impacts, sorry, but one of the biggest impacts of that is in local authorities, of course, because fire and rescue authorities also need fire engineers, and they won't be able to compete with some of those salaries.
No.
I think that's right, and of course it's a problem that you see right across the local government sector.
Yes.
The most obvious and the nearest parallel is in planning departments. It is massively difficult now to recruit and retain competent planning officers, and it's not a dissimilar, if you like, pond that we're fishing on. There's a limited number of people coming to do university or apprenticeship level entry into the planning world, the same as there is with fire engineers, the same as it is with people who go into building safety. So unless you increase that, when we had the debates on the building safety bill, this was a thing which MPs from both sides of the House were flagging up. So,
Yes.
The idea of a regulator, great, but it only works if the regulator is sufficiently resourced
Yes.
to be able to do the job properly, and also if you're realistic about the ability of the people who are going to the regulator to get the flow of work coming along. So you've got to make it more attractive. Now that's going to cost money from somewhere. Query is, at a time when Rachel Reeves is telling us there is no money, basically,
Yeah.
just in the same way as previous chancellors from my side would have said there's no money.
Yeah.
Are you going to squeeze it out of a treasury where you're in competition with doctors or nurses
Yes.
or teachers and so on? That's always the other problem for the fire service. Everybody loves the fire service and respects it, and everybody thinks fire safety is important, but it then gets into competition with other areas where equally worthy and sometimes more eye-catching in political terms. So that's a struggle for us. Do you then look at some other means of financing? That's why you can't be too, I think, purist about the role of the commercial sector in this.
Yes.
We need them to help deliver the process. That's why I agree with Ken. I think you can't be too purist about what the role of the regulator is. I got a sense of that in the Grenfell report as well, that they were a bit critical of regulators who actually had moved into an advisory role. But he can't go too far.
No.
But actually a good regulator ought to be able to helping some, not just saying you can't do it, but helping someone to say, here's how you can do it.
Yes.
Properly and safely and within the rules. You actually want a sort of a constructive regulator than a sort of yes/no tick box.
Yes.
But it does strike me, Bob, that it may not just be about we've had these sort of discussions before. Just more money. There is an organisational issue. And one of my historic reports talked about: are there too many fire and rescue services? There's more fire and rescue services than police forces. So could you consolidate? And fire engineering has always been fascinating to me, and I can understand why somewhere like London, where I was commissioner, of course, needs a standalone fire engineering department. But supposing you could regionalise that support in the way that regional crime squads work, that you bring expertise together and share it across regions, rather than expect 50 or so fire and rescue services from Cleveland to Shropshire to Cornwall having their own fire and rescue service, because often those their own fire engineers, because it's so often that fire engineering expertise is learned and shared to get the best competency rather than operating in silos. So I think it's not just about cash. I think it's about looking carefully at how these services are delivered to the best effect.
I sense it might be linked to a wider, not wishing to go too far off the subject, but obviously we know there's an issue with young people going into sort of STEM fields and stuff like that. So hence there is an issue with it's not a sexy occupation to go into, as a, it's not an advertised occupation to go into, being a fire risk assessor, being a fire engineer. If a young person is enthused by fire, they may join the fire brigade, because that's that's the sort of the front, that's the exciting side of it, if you like. But yeah, I think there's a bigger issue there of how we get young people through courses educated and inspired, because it's a industry, it's a well-paying industry, it's and it's an industry that we need, and there's nobody coming through at the moment, and it needs the private industry to drive that.
Yeah. So I've got the question I wanted to ask around to you, Sir Bob, was around, obviously you sat on an APPC group that talks around leaseholders and cladding, and you were you're very vocal about the needs of leaseholders at the time that EWS1 forms had been created and people being trapped in houses they couldn't sell. obviously, I have worked historically in a tier one, and Dave and I now work with tier ones who would be our clients, and I think contractors and developers ultimately they're held accountable for the problem, right? So they are front and center of the ownership of that problem, and obviously there's an expectation that obviously they should be paying to remediate buildings that they were either developers or contractors on, and there are a number of contractors who will have gone to the wall, I'm sure, paying for this stuff. Do you think, and this is probably controversial, do you think that there's culpability outside of the contractors at potentially a governmental level? Because there is a nuance between the contractors being responsible because of culture, which is very much what the Dame Judith Hackett has talked about in construction industry. But there is the subculture, but the more unpopular side that would say, well, actually, documents like Approved Document B, so statutory guidance, actually wouldn't have allowed them to deliver a safe outcome anyway. Do you feel that there's a culpability both sides? And I suppose the same question to you, Sir Ken, is it both sides of the coin that are responsible for that? Is it purely contractors and developers, or do we believe that the government have a responsibility in this, and authors of documentation has a responsibility in this for the crisis that we've seen around not Grenfell specifically, but other buildings where non-compliant cladding exists and non-compliant internals exists? How do you feel about those things?
Yeah, well, I think I said during some of the debates on the Building Safety Bill and some of the reports that the APPG that we were all involved in produced, that I think ultimately when there is a regulatory failure, the ultimate ownership of a statutory regulation is government, because government has set that regulation in the statutory form through Parliament.
Yes.
So ultimately, if there's a failure in that, the ultimate owner, if you like, has to be government. That means, of course, the taxpayers. That comes with a consequence. That doesn't mean, I think Michael Gove was right on this when he was trying to push forward it, that doesn't mean that you don't try and recoup as much as you can from those who have been involved on the contracting side or the other elements of the delivery side. As you say, you can argue there's been negligence by others outside purely the building and contracting sector. Doesn't mean you don't try and recoup as much as you can where you can. And for the points you fairly make, Tom, that won't always be possible. The case North Point, which I raised repeatedly in the House, first got me involved with the APPG. That's where you had a freeholder who was an overseas property trust.
Yes.
Some might say oligarchish property trust. Frankly, they were not interested in their tenants. They were holding the leaseholders to the onerous terms of a lease. These people had no money, been done by a firm which was no longer in existence. So the contractor was gone.
Yes.
Well, quite a well-known, nationally known developer, but they have been merged again and taken over again. So they just weren't there to go to. The subcontractors weren't probably to be found.
Yes.
In cases like that, ultimately, the people who should not lose out are the leaseholders who bought on in good faith.
Yes.
And they bought in good faith because, as far as they were concerned, effectively, government at either the national or the local level, it matters not for these purposes, has said this is safe. It's passed the building regs. It's got planning permission. It's met all the various boxes that you would expect a diligent buyer to inquire into and to be satisfied on. In those circumstances, I think government does have to pick up the tab, then try and get it back wherever you can. That's why a lot of us were arguing, you remember, Tom, that government should dip into the contingencies funds to advance the money, so that these people would get the work done, and they could then at least insure their flats. At least they could remortgage their flats if they needed to. At least they could sell them if they needed to, and move on with their lives, and then pursue the people who've got quite substantial pockets to get it back. That may take a bit of time. There was an interesting idea by the Leasehold Reform Group, which I'm sorry hasn't been taken forward. I hope Andrew Rayner might think about this. So in effect, you're going to get an income sooner or later from the recompense of this from these various companies that we now got the statutory form to go after, if you like. Why not treat that almost like a bond? We've got a guaranteed income, securitise that, and then you could raise that money almost as a bond. That would then pay out the money to the flat owners, they could then get their flats remediated as swiftly as capacity in the system permits, and they could then move on, and then you can recruit, because government is in a better position to bear a level of risk on its books
Yes.
than any individual flat owner or group of flat owners is. So I still think there's some unfinished business. There has been progress, and I think things have speeded up, but I still think there's a bit of work to be done there. And you're absolutely right. We can't. It would be too simple to say that we're just playing one bit of the chain.
Yes.
In all of this, there was a very broad-based chain of failure that the Grenfell report has shown.
But you're right, Tom. And you were saying who's responsible. You mentioned particularly approved document. Now, of course, the building regulations itself is not the approved document, and the building regulations we know is an outcome-based piece of regulation, and it's no surprise to me that Sir Martin, in both his Phase 1 report and his Phase 2 report, is absolutely confirmed that the Grenfell did not meet the building regulations.
No.
The conversation that you were just starting, which is really important, is the role of approved documents. Whether approved document B was as clear as it should have been, and of course he's recommended not that, but all the approved documents should be updated. And I can understand that as long as people don't believe that approved document B is anything more than guidance.
Absolutely.
Because it's got to continue to be guidance to allow for innovation and change and design. But of course, it's almost got more complicated, hasn't it, in the last 20 years? Because fire itself, in building regulation, approved documents terms, is not isolated from net zero requirements and health and safety and heat loss and making places pleasant to heat. So I'm not sure it's easy to tweak one piece of approved document without a look at
Affecting everything else.
the whole
right.
thing. And more than that, because we now have a building safety regulator, of course, it's got slightly more complicated because, of course, it'll be the building safety regulator that's looking at the approved documents and recommending to the Secretary of State,
Yes.
separate from that, whether to accept those changes. So I think we need to work through that very carefully so it doesn't slow down the system, because he's right that you need to keep pace with innovation and change, but innovation and change in building materials is really fast.
Oh, really fast.
So it's going to be quite difficult to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we've talked about the Moral Day report and obviously talking about construction products, and obviously the Moral Day report identified quite clearly that there was a capacity issue. And there we go, that word again. There's a capacity issue in testing. And obviously the assumption is that capacity problem in testing means there's not enough furnaces. And the reality of that is that actually it's the full chain of custody around the capacity of competent people to design what you're about to test. That having people that can write regulation or write standards for testing, someone that can oversee the tests, then you've got the actual laboratory and the staff of the laboratory, the interpretation of the tests. So actually that whole industry is enormous, and the capacity problem is more than just not having enough ovens to burn the stuff in. But as more novel building products get created, there is an issue around how do you not necessarily legislate for them, but how do you test them and approve them in a way that ensures safety? And I believe potentially that a lot of the issues around the sorts of materials that we've seen across the UK fundamentally is that potentially, and not that it's an excuse, because you quite rightly say it's not statutory in a respect you have to follow approved document B is one method of potentially meeting the building regulations. Obviously, the lack of clarity in that document, or perceived lack of clarity, maybe that's the better way of saying it, has meant that products that are not fit for purpose maybe meet that particular part of guidance, but doesn't meet the principles of the building regulations. And I think potentially with Grenfell Tower, it's the first time we've actually seen that in real life, right, where we've potentially met the guidance, but that hasn't met the requirements of building regulations. And a lot of that, I think, is that the products had accelerated so quickly through their development because they were so modern, the products were so modern that approved document B simply hadn't caught up.
Yeah, that's a real issue, isn't it? And it's going to get more and more, it seems to me. That's going to grow rather than go away, Tom.
Absolutely.
Because, technology always expands, it increases in volume.
Yes.
And there's a broader sort of macro picture issue around this as well, isn't it? We've got a commitment to building more and more homes in this country.
Yes.
That was a consideration even back in 2010, 2012, when we were thinking about the regulatory burden.
Yes.
And that threw up some of those issues around red tape challenge, because the case being made was, well, too much regulation, that's extra cost for house builders, and therefore that will slow up the rate of house building that the government, with I think public support, was committed to trying to achieve. We've got a new government, exactly the same pressures, even greater pressures on building more houses, even greater political imperative for them to do that. Part, not all of it, but part of that is going to be finding the most cost-effective, swiftly deliverable means of construction.
Yes.
The bit we've got to make sure is that they are safe means of construction.
Absolutely.
But the need always to seek a new solution that will save costs, save time in meeting that housing demand. It's not going to go away anytime soon, and that's why it's all the more important that we get this quite small bit in money terms right.
Yes.
It also needs the real investment, although it's small, and in the people.
And because we need that rapid learning, we can't do it in a silo either, can we? We can't do that learning just in England and forget the UK. And we can't do it just in the UK and forgetting the rest of the world, because there's international learning as well from exactly the same complex challenges that are going on, both from safety and from net zero. So, and Sir Martin makes that point, as did Judith, of course. So I think it's a really complex landscape, and I'm really pleased to see the Grenfell Inquiry report come out with this final report. I really look forward to the government's response to it in whole and part. But it really is only the start of a whole range of other changes, not the end of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Dame Judith said, she believes that in 10 years' time, we'll definitely probably have to review where we're at and modify the course slightly, because it's the biggest change that we've had in a generation, right? It's the biggest building regulatory change we've ever had.
Well, I think that may well be the subject of future episode, London build that we've got planned.
Absolutely.
Where we go from here. Quite looking forward to that. I think just to finish off, and this is a question to both of you, sort of looking back over your careers, your respective careers, what are you most proud of, and what do you see as your legacy that you've left behind? Maybe Sir Bob.
Doesn't have to be fire related either.
No, well, I mean, the time I spent involved with the fire service was brilliant, and a fascinating period of my career, which I enjoyed hugely, and always think very, very, very warmly of it. I think purely in that area, I do think persuading those higher up the food chain that the fire safety regulation should be kept out of red tape challenge was important. It was actually quite a big political win at the time. I think also it's a different thing, but managing to get reform of the fire service pension scheme, which also came on my desk apart from all of this, without having a strike over it, which was quite a hard task, was actually something that was worthwhile. And I think the Fire Futures review that Ken and I did, which was setting up a new basis for FRIs going forward, but were all very worthwhile achievements. That's within that part of the world. I was lucky enough to do a lot of other things. I was involved, after all, as one of the ministers responsible for the National Planning Policy Framework, which again I think has made real advances, but there's still work to do. That needs updating now. We always need to update. But I suppose the other area of activity was, for 10 years I chaired the Justice Committee in the House of Commons as a backbencher. And if I succeeded to a degree in making the case for criminal justice and all forms of justice, civil justice and family justice, to be given a higher political priority, I think I'm proud of that. I'm proud of having seen off some changes to our legal system, for example, a Bill of Rights, which I think would have been a complete waste of time and would have got us absolutely nowhere and gone down a rabbit hole. Sometimes the successes are the things you stop other people doing. So I think that was a bit of a success. Changes around the rules in relation to prisoners on indefinite sentences for public protection, where David Blunkett and I formed a bit of an alliance to make progress on that. I think those are things that make an impact on people's lives as well, and on the system. So I've been lucky to have a varied career where I've able to have a number of achievements and a few frustrations, and probably a few things that I still think were unfinished business when I left.
So Ken,
I think for me, I feel very privileged, actually. My first job wasn't fire; it was banking, and I had an excursion in banking. I thought, this isn't for me. I'm going to become a firefighter. And I can honestly say there isn't a single day I didn't want to go to work. Now, that's a great privilege. There's many jobs you couldn't say that in. That's not the fault of the people working in them. Some jobs are pretty laborious and unfortunately not so interesting. I therefore found it has been a very fulfilling whatever I've been doing. But it has relied almost entirely on teams, the teams that I've worked with, the ability for them. I had a particular moment in London Fire Brigade, not as a chief, but as an assistant chief after the King's Cross fire. I was on secondment in the Home Office. I was made an assistant chief in London Fire Brigade, and asked to lead a team about the changes of equipment, the changes of protection, and I had a team that you could have done a moonshot with. If I'd have said, we're going to the moon, they'd have said to me, what day are we going, Gov? They wouldn't have questioned it. They had new cutting equipment. There was people across in the United States finding new lightweight cylinders instead of the steel cylinders that were being used at that time. And so I can look at moments and thinking that it was the teams that actually made a huge difference. And I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud to supposedly lead those teams, but to know that there was people that actually wanted to make a difference. I found that too in my second day as the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor, second or third day in 2007. Very sadly, 4 firefighters died in Warwickshire and Atherstone. And I was asked to go to Warwickshire and be part of the Gold Command with the police, looking at this very difficult incident, which ended up with a manslaughter case. And so at each stage, I've found that it's not been just privilege, but learning, and no less so than working with people like Bob. I mean, finding myself and suddenly speaking to ministers firsthand and sharing experiences and taking advice. With hindsight, not always right, of course. That's not what life is like. And looking back, would I have made the same decisions? Not necessarily with hindsight. But I never look back and think I regret joining the fire service and having the days I've had. And that's why people keep saying to me, when you're going to retire, because they wish I would. But I'm not ready for that either yet.
Well, I'm very grateful that the team that went to find lightweight sets found them. I don't think I would have enjoyed long duration sets if both of them were steel, that's for sure.
Tom, what's your legacy? When are you going to retire?
There's no danger of me retiring ever, I don't think. I'm hoping that our children maybe will interview us here when, in 30, 40 years' time, maybe 50 years' time, I'll still be going. That's my plan.
I think maybe we need to retire from this show for
No, I reckon
this
we'll be doing
episode.
this. We'll still be doing this show.
Only for this episode.
Too early for us to talk about legacy, Dave, for sure. We're only on episode 6. You're going to ask a question that's going to make everyone in the room cringe, aren't you?
I'm not going to do it this week.
I think you have to.
Not going to.
Now I demand it.
So, Bob, are you going to join backdraftmovie.com fan club?
I could have to find out what it is for a start, Dave, aren't I?
Good. It's a perfect question.
Okay, you'll be one of a prominent few members. It's free to join.
Rightio.
And you get a free picture of Kurt Russell emailed to you once a month.
Well, this is a massive temptation, isn't it? Now, let me just reflect on that before I commit myself to anything on air, though. There's still a bit of a politician left in me,
Yeah. So for context, Dave's favourite movie of all time is obviously Backdraft. It's the natural choice for him. So he has a website and he has the UK chapter of the Backdraft Movie Appreciation Society. So everybody that sits on the sofa gets asked.
Before Sekin criticises, I appreciate the fire science within Backdraft is very, very poor.
Weak at best.
I think it's better in the Universal Studios, actually.
Yeah.
It's a better ride than it is a film.
I'm still at the level of the Italian.
That's a good
my
point.
vintage,
I don't profess it to be, an accurate film, just an all-time great film.
Have you watched it recently?
I've watched it this year.
So that's pretty recent. I haven't watched it.
I mean, it depends what you call recent.
Yeah. So I'm hoping they'll both join. We'll make sure they do join because we've gone from one member at the beginning of this podcast and to how many have you got now?
Well, it'll be 147 if Steve Lakey, our guest from last week,
So 140. So
does
possibly
follow up
two
and
takes us
does
to
join.
149. So that's pretty impressive growth, actually. I think that's great. Well, look, gentlemen, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time, and I'm sure that our listeners will really appreciate your insight. So I think, look, it's important to note for all of our listeners that we're an independent and neutral show, and anybody that wants to get involved can message us on LinkedIn and follow our page and website. We'd obviously love to hear from you if you'd like to appear on the show in the future, or if you want to comment on anything that we've said in the past, drop us a message and we will bring you to the studio to discuss. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you, Dave.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
See you.
See you next week.